episode 4 of the Last Minute Podcast. My name's Jeremy Etheridge.
Derek,
Good to see you today, Derek. How are you?
I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, thanks. Today is November 22nd, 2024.
What are you going to be getting into today?
Well, it's been an interesting month, and so I think where we've landed is we're gonna kind of pace ourselves through one primary topic, and I think we're just gonna let it go where the spirit leads us through that topic. The topic for today is let me make sure I have the phrasing exactly right. Here we are.
While you're flipping through,
Sorry?
you might want to change it to dark mode so you don't get that.
Oh, yeah, good call. Thank you. So today's topic is not that. All right, here we are, and it was in this one. So, freedom of speech or suppression, the battle over racial discourse, exploring how race-focused topics, if I could speak, race-focused topics are discussed and censored in public and political arenas in the United States and abroad. So it's a wide topic today, and we'll just baby step through it. How do you eat an elephant?
One bite at a time.
One bite at a time. All right. So, before we launch in, do you have anything, or do you have anything you wanted to add to the slate, the agenda, or we're just going to run down run down this line?
I think this topic is very big and very wide. So,
All right.
yeah, this is going to be definitely a big focus for us.
Okay. All right. Well, then, so let's start with, and I've kind of broken it up into two logical categories. So the first one is essentially sources online and proposals that are proposing that there is an attack on free speech and what that looks like. Because as we'll find as we dig into this a bit, there are a couple of different perspectives on the freedom of speech and the suppression of speech front. And so the first avenue that we'll take is essentially looking at the various parties that are saying that free speech is under attack, that our right to free speech is under attack. And the second avenue that we'll take is sources, as far as where we see evidence that freedom of speech has either been discarded, violated, or is clearly under attack. So the first aspect, or the first line that we're going to carve through or cut through, is experts say that attacks on free speech are rising across the U.S. This is an article with, and actually, were you as surprised as I was at how many of these centered on Russia?
Yeah, I was surprised, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I knew that there were issues regarding free speech because, we've heard about things like rigged elections or things like that, but I don't guess I'd realized they were as vigilant with their attack on freedom of speech as they are. This is a case where a Russian woman was jailed for 8 years after demanding Putin's death over the Ukrainian war. Now, this one I was surprised on because...
Surprised?
Well, I was surprised that it wasn't harsher because she didn't just criticize Putin and the Ukraine war. She demanded that he die. She was calling for people to assassinate him, and I mean he rules with an iron fist over there. So it's probably not the best place to be saying things like, screw Putin and I hope Putin dies, and this is a call to all men out there. We need to take care of Vladimir Putin type thing.
I guess you could say she was very passionate about what she wanted to say.
I suppose so. And she's going to have 8 years to sit around and contemplate that passion because she was sentenced to 8 years in a gulag. So November 14th, so this was right at a week and a half ago, a military court in Moscow sentenced a 43-year-old woman to 8 years in a penal colony on Thursday for posting anti-war comments online, including several calling for the assassination of President Vladimir Putin, Russian news agencies reported. Anastasia, and I cannot pronounce her last name, Anastasia Berezinskaya is my best guess. Apologies. A Moscow-based theater director and mother of 2 young children was found guilty of 2 wartime censorship laws, discrediting the Russian army and spreading false information about it, as well as justifying terrorism. So more than 1,000 people have been criminally prosecuted in Russia for speaking out against the war in Ukraine, according to Rights Project OVD Info, and over 20,000 have been detained for protesting. On Tuesday, a Moscow court sentenced a 68-year-old pediatrician to 5.5 years in prison, and after the mother of one of her patients publicly denounced her over comments about Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Then, in the first months following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, I'm just going to have to bite the bullet and pick a way to say it. Berezhinskaya published dozens of posts online against the conflict, the Russian army, the Interior Ministry, and Putin himself. She said, "We are waging a genocide against the Ukrainian people." On March 14th, 2022, she posted over 3 dozen times on Vkonkate, a social network, hurling insults at Putin, saying he bore personal responsibility for the deaths of men, women, and children whose bodies were being pulled from under the rubble of the Ukrainian apartment blocks. Moscow denies deliberately attacking civilians in what it calls special military operations, although thousands have died in Russian attacks. As Berezhinskaya continued to post that day in May, she began to call for the death of Putin, who at 72 years old is on course to become Russia's longest-serving leader since Empress Catherine the Great in the 18th century. "Shoot that stupid bastard, Putin. How many more murders of civilians do we have to bear?" she wrote. "Wipe him off the face of the earth." So that's why I was surprised, because that was absolutely just calling him out, and I did not think that it was wise, and apparently it turns out it's not wise to criticize Putin in such a manner if you're a Russian citizen.
Right. She was very passionate about that. She has 2 kids, young kids.
Yeah. Now they're going to be raised by by someone else, at least for the next 8 years. So, what did Alison Pearson do wrong? UK's free speech laws explained. So this one sort of is the first of a couple that delve into the attack on the rights, the freedom of speech in the UK and in Europe at large. So the Telegraph journalist was accused of inciting racial hatred when she posted a tweet about the policing of the Gaza protests. The criminal investigation into Alison Pearson, into her tweet, has exposed the number of different laws that could be used to take action over social media posts. Pearson, who writes for the Daily Telegraph, is being investigated for the alleged offense of inciting racial hatred after a tweet she posted, then deleted on X. It's a criminal offense under the Public Order Act of 1986 to use threatening, abusive, or insulting language, intended or likely in all the circumstances to stir up racial hatred. Wow. Crown Prosecution Service guidance says it is essential that prosecutors keep in mind that in a free, democratic, and tolerant society, people can exchange robust views, even when they may cause offense. However, it says that a right to freedom of expression must be balanced against the state's duty to act, and this is in quotes, to act proportionately in the interests of public safety, to prevent disorder and crime, and to protect the rights of others. That sounds ironic to me. The range of legislative covering electronic communications includes several laws that social media users could breach. The new Online Safety Act has created offenses of false communications and threatening communications. False communication offenses, which carry a maximum jail sentence of 12 months, are cases in which someone conveys false information to cause non-trivial psychological or physical harm. Threatening communication offenses involve cases in which a person conveys a threat of death or serious harm and carry a maximum 5-year jail term. A person can also fall foul of harassment under the Equality Act of 2010 if they create an intimidating, hostile, humiliating, or offensive environment on the basis of protected characteristics. It has previously emerged that the police forces in the UK recorded more than 13,200 non-crime hate incidents in the 12 months. I'm assuming that means prior to June. Pearson has denied the allegations of stirring up racial hatred. So we've heard a lot about this. I've heard a lot about this specifically in the UK lately. The last number I heard, which I would have to look up to be precise, but I thought it was in the neighborhood of like 3,300 people had been jailed for posting content of varying degrees of threatening and whatever criticisms on social media.
And that was in like the last year?
That's been in the last 2 years from when I here, let me fact check that. Yeah, UK. So if we look for UK jails for let's do social media posting. So it says arrested for posting. This was in 2024. It looks like a lot of these are just individual cases, but have been sentenced to 38 months and 20 months in prison for stirring up racial hatred online during the summer riots. Yeah, I don't know. They seem to be hesitant to list the total numbers, but yeah, there it is. There were about 1,200 referrals, posts flagged to police by members of the public, alone in relation to the riots. He said that was just the tip of the iceberg. The unit saw 13 times more referrals in relation to X than TikTok. So there are thousands of these.
Yeah.
And I've even heard rumors. I don't know that it's actual news. I've heard rumors of them having to like clear out previous offenders from the jails to make room because their prison systems are at capacity. So, yeah. All right. So next, moving on. The Free Expression Policy Project. So this is the NCAC, which is the National Coalition Against Censorship. In the wake of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, and the U.S. government's efforts to combat terrorism by often secretive or constitutionally dubious means, questions have arisen about the scope of the First Amendment protection for political protest and dissent. This fact sheet, originally prepared for a November 2006 conference on civil liberties in a paranoid society, outlines the history and constitutional status of political protests and the free speech implications of today's government surveillance and secrecy. The fact sheet hits many of the political and judicial highlights, but necessarily it cannot present a complete picture of this rich vein in American history and law. So, panic and patriotism, dissent in U.S. history, the high status of political speech. This one is a collection of legislation dealing with it. And yeah, so there's a lot of these in here. Here, I'm going to go ahead and jump because we end up back here. This is Wikipedia. I don't think I want to, it looks like most of them are there. I don't want to dig through Wikipedia. So apparently censorship has become a huge issue in Germany, in Russia. This was a case, had you heard of this one? The Matamasser, if I'm saying their name correctly.
Yeah, that's right.
An independent.
I heard that one. No.
You had, yeah, an independent Egyptian online newspaper founded in June 2013 by former journalist of the English language newspaper Egypt Independent, following the shutdown of its editorial operations in 2013. So apparently, this is one where censorship, where they were ordered to censor information on behalf of the government. And it looks like a number of them ended up quitting in protest. And so Egypt is problematic. Then Russian censorship laws, there's a war, it says. And lastly, they were arrested for posting during the riots. Will it change anything? K26 and Parler 28 have been sentenced to 38 months and 20 months in prison, respectively, for stirring up racial hatred online during the riots. I'm interested in seeing what it was they said. More than 30 people found themselves arrested over social media posts. From what I've found, at least 17 of them have been charged. They'll have deemed that some of the investigations did not meet the threshold for criminality. Go figure. At the time of the riots, wondered if this would be the moment that would finally change the online landscape. Now, though, I am not so sure. To make sense of the role of social media giants in all this, it's useful to start by looking at the case of a dad in Pakistan and a businesswoman from Chester. On X, formerly known as Twitter, a pseudo-news website. Huh. Yeah, I was just making sure I read that right. On X, formerly known as Twitter, a pseudo-news website called Channel 3 Now posted a false name of the 17-year-old charged over the murders of 3 girls in Southport. This false name was then widely quoted by others. Another poster who shared the false name on X was Bernadette. That's her last name. I'm not going to spread her last name. A 55-year-old from Chester with more than 50,000 followers. She had previously shared posts raising questions about lockdown and net zero climate change measures. The posts from Channel 3 Now and Miss Spa, that's right.
Yeah,
Right. Also wrongly suggested the 17-year-old was an asylum seeker who had arrived in UK by boat. All of this combined with further untrue claims from other sources that the attacker was a Muslim and was widely blamed for contributing to the riots, some of which targeted mosques and asylum seekers. They found that Channel 3 Now was connected to a man named this name in Pakistan, as well as a hockey player in Nova Scotia, and someone who claimed to be called Kevin. The site appeared to be a commercial operation looking to increase views and sell advertisements. At the time, a person claiming to be from Channel 3 Now's Now's management told me that the publication of the false name was an error, not intentional, and denied being the origin of that name. And this young lady said that she deleted her untrue post about the suspect as soon as she realized it was false. She also strongly denied that she had made the name up. So what happens next? The fueling riots. Let's see. They were both arrested over these posts not long after they spoke to them. Charges, however, were dropped. Authorities in Pakistan said they could not find evidence that these two were the originators of the fake name. But let's pause for a second, because keep in mind, this is a search for the person that created false information, which is a slippery slope at best. Cheshire police also decided not to charge this young lady due to insufficient evidence. Well, it's lucky for her. Miss Farron seems to have gone to the ground. The Channel 3 Now site and several connected social media pages have been removed. Now they're posting back regularly on X. This week alone, they've had more than 1 million views across posts. She says she's become an advocate for freedom of expression since her arrest. She says, as has been shown, the idea that one single tweet could be the catalyst for the riots, which followed the atrocities in Southport, is simply not true. Focusing on these individual cases can offer a valuable insight into who shares this kind of content and why. But again, I'm more disturbed by the focus, which is more around finding out who the perpetrators of this misinformation was, right? And that kind of segues us into what we are dealing with here at home. What do you see on this front? I've been running my mouth a lot. What do you see?
Well, yeah, I think here in America, we should be thankful that we do have, the freedom of speech to be able to say what we want to say. Either it's hate speech, I don't like hate speech, but it's protected, right? So,
well, speech is protected. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Speech is protected.
Yes.
But at the same time, with this incident, you have to be careful. Like, there are certain outlets that they can't just say anything and not be fact checked. Like, if you're giving news to anybody, anything, it needs to be clear. You need to have factual information that's coming out. You just can't say any and everything and not check it. I mean, we see a lot of that stuff today. With TV shows. I guess I'm not going to go into specific channels or anything like that.
Yeah.
But they'll say things and no, it's not true. And it's just a simple search away. Like, everybody has Google, everybody has access on their phone. It's just a simple search, and you say something that can actually spark something. It doesn't matter if that wasn't the main reason, but it's the spark
Mm,
that you throw in the gasoline.
yeah.
Um,
Well,
I just,
you have to consider the fact that this is the. Let's examine for a minute why this is such a slippery slope, right? Because the whole concept, the quintessentially American, I would say, concept of freedom of speech. There's a reason, and I've mentioned this before. There's a reason it's the First Amendment, because if we lose that, if you do not have the right to say what you feel and what you think and what you believe, without fear of retribution and persecution, then all of the other rights sort of become uh, jeopardized, right?
right. That's the
Because
point, yeah.
because I can't think of any political movements, political ideologies, social movements, cultural movements that didn't first begin as controversial to someone. So you run into the problem of, well, controversial to who? Who is it that doesn't like it? And, God forbid those people ever end up in control of the apparatus responsible for regulating and censoring,
Mhm.
because that allows them to shut down opposition and control narratives, which is like the slip and slide ride to fascism 101. So it's a dangerous topic for sure.
Right.
Um, how do you feel that this is relevant today in the U.S. specifically? Because I have a number of ways that I see this playing out locally and nationally. Have you seen the same thing?
Yeah, I guess it's a certain movement that I guess we're trying to make in the U.S. by limiting what people can say. It's, um, I guess a good example could be like channels
Mm,
the influencers use. They censor certain words that you can't say.
right.
It could be factual. I mean, it's nothing provocative about the words.
We're
They're
releasing
just
this
words.
on YouTube, and
Yeah,
it's the same thing. There are
yeah,
words that we can't say around this topic. That's right.
right. And I don't even like you said, it's a slippery slope. You don't want to go down that path where you're censoring everything. This is
Right.
important things.
Right.
Um, yeah, I think America is in a dangerous position of just losing that freedom of speech. And that's not a position you want to be in.
Right.
This is what the country was founded on.
Right.
And you see what's happening in other countries. You want to jail people, put them away for 8 years, for speaking their mind.
And 8 years or 8 minutes isn't the point, but you're
And
exactly
yeah,
right. 8 minutes is too much, but yeah. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the sort of the crux of the freedom of speech issue is the fact that it was created to protect speech that you don't like, right? That's the
mm,
entire point. Everybody's fine with speech that they agree with. It's when you hear something that you don't like, or something that you personally deem to be dangerous, or you deem to be inappropriate or wrong, that's when the freedom of speech becomes most paramount. Is the ability to say something without having to concern myself on whether you agree with it or not, or whether it's going to bother you. Now that
mm,
said, there's a fine line here somewhere, right? I'd like to kind of suss that out a bit, because I'm interested in hearing what you think specifically on the idea of, I guess let's turn the reins a little bit towards, let's say, hate speech, right? Because that's one that I think, while it's certainly very difficult to define, the spirit of it is something that we can all identify with, right? Something
right.
that's just clearly motivated by hatred, whether you're talking about racism or discrimination of any type. Hate speech is something that I think everybody would agree that the world would be much better off without.
Right. But the problem is like who gets to decide,
Right? What's
what is
hateful?
hate? Yes.
Yeah.
That's the problem. I mean, I guess collectively, we can still be wrong collectively, but that's how Germany goes. People will say that, I disagree that, anything with, I guess, Nazi ideology. I
Mm-hmm.
guess other people
Mm-hmm.
will say, that's wrong. We'll never want to have discussions about that.
Mm-hmm.
But, It's just how it's delivered, and like the case. What is the case for who's going to make a judgment that what you're saying is wrong?
Right.
The content, the subject, the tone.
Right. Even
You
turning it
know,
over to a jury of your peers is dangerous
right?
because everybody's different. And yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's my whole point right
Right.
there.
Right. Well, I mean, and it's valid that the trick becomes who does the regulating, how do they judge the regulations, and it's a slippery slope that I think most of us can agree we just don't want to get into.
Right.
Right? There's a reason it's the First Amendment, right? Because all of the other ones are predicated upon its existence. If you don't have the freedom of speech, you don't get the chance to argue whether or not your views on gun control are valid or your views on personal property rights are valid. And so I agree with you that we are in a very precarious time in the United States right now. It feels, and I don't know how much of this is a result of the narratives that have been pushed over the last, let's say, few years, even decade, let's say. But it feels like there has been a very concerted effort to minimize the role of free speech when parties or people in power have had a vested interest in either suppressing or controlling what people are saying. And I'm sure that it's existed in the past and we just weren't there to experience it, right? There's a reason that the Constitution was drawn the way that it was, and the war with Britain and the way we handled our Revolutionary War was revolutionary. But seriously, people were tired of not being able to speak out against injustices that they saw, and so that's the reason it sort of became in many ways the backbone of our Constitution and our society.
Found it, yeah.
That's right. And so I can't think of a time in our lifetime that it has come under such direct attack. Hearing, and I won't go into whom, but hearing politicians say things like people shouldn't be allowed to communicate to large groups of people without any type of supervision or oversight is really frightening to hear. Hearing things like excuse me, my voice is a little scratchy today. Hearing things like the First Amendment is a privilege, not a right, is frightening, right? Because it starts to evidence itself as this progressive sort of organized attack on something that seems to be standing in people's way in one way or another.
It's kind of hard to take away people's rights, but it's kind of easy to take away people's privileges.
Right. That's right. That's right. It's a little easier. That's right.
Yeah.
Especially because people aren't really comfortable standing up and saying that's a privilege. I'm privileged, and so yeah, it's been frightening in the last couple of years in particular.
It's kind of interesting though. I think maybe it kind of started off like as a pebble, back when we were growing up, in the 80s, 90s and stuff. It started with a pebble like what is called political correctness. PC, when we started censoring little small things like you shouldn't say this, you shouldn't call people that,
Right.
And then it gets into, I guess, something like it involves or evolves into something like a wolf in sheep's clothing, where it's how can we use this as a political measure?
Right.
How can we get people on the side of this? And we'll just keep adding these little things. We'll just start censoring right here, just like
Right.
little things, and then it starts coming up to big things.
Right.
And then how far does that go?
And before you know it, you have a cudgel that you're just beating people over the head with. That's right. A good example would be the Patriot Act. Right. The Patriot Act arguably was one of the most profound or impactful assaults on liberties in this country that has ever occurred,
Mm-hmm.
and it was done at a time when the government had been waging a war, a propaganda war, if you'll recall. The whole idea of this axis of evil, and there's this bad boogeyman out there that didn't have anything to do with the attacks on us, but we are going to loosely associate the two just to so we don't
Yeah.
have to keep explaining ourselves.
Best way to unite people, right?
Right. And so we ended up mobilizing our country, our militaries, and the industrial complexes behind it, and it was that was a huge change. I still don't know that most Americans are aware of exactly how many liberties were forfeited in that particular circumstance. That's where the CIA
Started
gained
introducing
authorization
like
to begin.
torture and stuff
Well,
like that.
that
Because
was
of something
that
like that.
was that's a slightly different topic, but yeah, definitely that was in there. But what I was thinking of was the CIA gained the right to spy on private citizens,
Mm-hmm.
which we're getting some visitors in here, which was a huge shift, to actually turn any of the Department of Justice apparatuses against the American people is a foundational shift as far as what their role is and what the role of the government is. Because all of a sudden you end up in this spot where it's almost as if, well, the issue is terror, right? And we have all of these subversive groups that are operating in secret. And if we just have the ability to overstep some of the rights and some of the boundaries, we can be more effective at stopping them beforehand. And because we just had the 9/11 had just had the 9/11 attacks, people were more inclined to say, okay, yes, we whatever
Mm-hmm.
it takes to stop that, we have to band together. Well, unfortunately, there were certainly people behind the scenes that were pulling the strings on that particular puppet um, that knew that when a liberty or a right is forfeited, it's very difficult
Yeah,
to get it back.
fear is a very powerful tool.
It really is, especially when you're talking about swaying things like public opinion and now when people look back at 9/11 and that time frame in general, right? We had an attack against us that was then used to mobilize against a completely unrelated party that ultimately destabilized the entire region, right? Caused tons of, I mean, not just the millions of lives that were lost, but tons of downstream consequences that we're still paying for to this day.
Right.
I could make a pretty solid argument that the Ukraine war is a downstream effect of the destabilization that occurred by removing Saddam Hussein and all of that. So, and I'm not going to go into that, but the point is just that there are profound consequences, and it looks like they're not sleeping, right? They're continuing to try to chip away, and in this case, I don't know exactly who they are. I just know that whoever they are has waged an assault on the American people, and I'm hopeful that we will wake up
Mm.
before it's too late or before we surrender something that can't be unsurrendered. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, here's the hope and
Say it again.
so yeah, cheers to hope in that.
Yeah, cheers to
Throw
hoping.
that.
Yes, agreed. Okay, so let's delve into the second avenue of this, which is essentially the and we kind of diverged from it, but now we mentioned when we first broached the subject that there were sort of a couple of different agendas involved with the whole free speech here at home versus abroad, and one of those, for example, you want to introduce? Why don't you introduce a couple of them to us, and let's walk into these because yeah, why don't you lead us there?
Yeah, I guess this attack is going to be on our educational system.
Yeah, which makes sense.
see.
You get them when
Says,
you're young, and you'll have them for life.
there you go. Experts say attacks on free speech are rising across the U.S. Boise, Idaho. In Idaho, an expert exhibit was censored, and teens were told they couldn't testify in some legislative hearings. In Washington state, a lawmaker proposed a hotline so the government could track offensively biased statements as well as hate crimes. In Florida, bloggers are fighting a bill that will force them to register with the state if they write posts criticizing public officials.
Right.
Meanwhile, bans on books and drag performances are growing increasingly common nationwide.
That's a strange intersection there.
Well, you enjoy it's a good drag performance.
Right. Apparently, elementary school students.
Apparently,
Right. Right.
K through 12.
Right. Right. No, that seemed odd to sort of tie in drag performances into this topic, and I guess
Well,
I guess we were talking about the different avenues, right? This is one of them.
It's like a side street.
This is, I think they may all be tied into this main boulevard, which is the whole idea of keeping certain things out of schools, so we're not exposing our children to it. But there, even in those camps, there are different agendas and different reasons for doing that. So
Right. This is, well, I guess we're saying this all just like saying it's there's a point where the state shouldn't overstep. They shouldn't be teaching our kids about sexual and adult situations, gender affirmative,
yeah,
identity,
yeah.
things like that.
Well, that's actually what this one was saying essentially in this article, right? It was saying
Right.
that, and that's why they tied the drag performances in. But
Very
what it
important.
right, the accusation. Can you give us a nutshell of this topic essentially? Like what is it that these guys are advocating here, and what is it that we're seeing play out on this topic?
On this topic, let's see, we're saying right there that we're seeing a wave of bills targeting drag performances, where simply being gender nonconforming is enough to trigger the penalty. We're also seeing a wave of bills regulating what can be in public or K-12 school libraries. Someone says on college campuses, we have been tracking data about attempts to get faculty members punished or even fired for speech or expression, and the numbers are startling. It's the highest rate that we've seen in our 20 years of existence.
And who is this? Out of curiosity, this is PBS. So this is the public broadcasting system.
Yeah, that is.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot going on with that.
Well, what I find interesting about this, and I didn't mean to interrupt you. Was I cutting you
No,
off?
I'm just trying to take it all in with this article.
It's a lot. It covers a lot of ground, and they kind of go scorched earth on some topics. But from what I understand, this is sort of tying in the whole concept of freedom of speech, allowing or rather focusing on the prohibition or prohibiting certain materials from being accessible to different degrees or different ages of children in schools and publicly funded libraries.
Minors.
Right, minor being the most important aspect of this. But it delves into and it attempts to make a case that by prohibiting drag shows and by preventing access to gender I want to say ideology, but I don't want to try to demonize it in any way. Gender affirming care, gender studies, gender all of the stuff that's wrapped into that. It's sort of tying them in together and saying that there appears to be a concerted attack on freedom of speech. And I'm not sure I see it that way, right? I feel like when you enter the realm, the no man's land of of minors and children who are being raised by parents, then the role of the state becomes extremely pertinent, right? What does the state have the right to teach your children? And perhaps more importantly, what do they not have the right to teach? And I don't think anybody is arguing that the state can't teach kids what gender is. I It gives me pause considering that there are a number of state personnel and institutions that don't seem to understand what gender is or recognize what gender is.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it's this topic of, and I'll take it back to my kids. What am I comfortable with the state of Tennessee or the United States government teaching my children? And it gets real uncomfortable when we talk about sex and sex ideologies and very things that I think should be taught at home.
Yeah, I mean, you get uncomfortable talking about ideologies, right?
Sure.
So, you can talk about biology, science, things like that, which you send your kids to school to learn.
Sociology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sociology, yes, all of that. But yeah, there is a line to be crossed. Like the things that they're learning, teaching kids gender identity and things. That's something that the parents should be. That should be their job, their responsibility.
Right. Agreed.
I think we can. I don't know if we can go to the other topic where we were talking about. It's kind of similar to what censoring or what we should be teaching our kids in school. Like there are certain things. Like you brought up an interesting topic that's on my mind right now. I don't know if we want to go into that.
What's that?
But what should be taught in school? What
rights does the state have to teach? Is that where you're going toward it?
Right. That's where I was going towards.
Yeah.
Well, that's something else, but
Yeah, I pulled up a different article that I'm going to reference in a minute, so it's fine.
yeah. I mean, we'll get to it when we get to that
Sure.
section.
Sure. So I think it's worth mentioning that we talked before about the concept of parenting being the most critical factor in success for children in school.
Right.
And of course that's the case, but this also sort of falls under the same umbrella because there are things that it doesn't really matter whether I agree with certain positions. It's not something I want the state teaching my children, or I want the city teaching my children, or the public school system teaching my children. It's something I want to teach my children, and it's a hairy subject because the razor blade or the knife's edge is how do we protect historically marginalized groups of people. And again, we're back to ideologies, which I would seriously prefer to not legislate, but how do we protect historically marginalized groups of people? And I personally believe we have to find a solution that does not involve implementing new ideologies, right? It's this idea of, because this group of people, this has been historically marginalized, we have to, and I'm being vague, and I'm realizing that there, without being concrete, this could be applied in many different ways to many different things. Specifically, let's stick with the subject of gender affirming care and gender studies. That's something that I feel falls within the domain of the parent and being taught by your parents. And there are concrete science components that definitely should be taught by school, right? I mean, we know the genders, we know what aspects and typical things associated with genders are, but from a scientific standpoint, there's no ideology involved. It's just what is.
Right.
There's this gray line, however, I don't know why I said gray. There's this line that has been erected as far as how are we going to approach it from a government standpoint? And I'll reference the article I just pulled up, which is the new law establishes Minnesota as a trans refuge state. And it says that Minnesota is now a trans refuge state due to a new law that prevents out-of-state laws from interfering in the practice of gender-affirming health care here. Sponsored by Representative Lee Finke and Senator Erin May Cade, the law took effect April 28, 2023. Specifically, the law prohibits the enforcement of a court order for removal of a child or enforcement of another state's law being applied in pending child protection action in Minnesota. When the law of another state allows the child to be removed from the parent or guardian for receiving medically necessary health care or mental health care that respects the gender identity of the patient. The law gives Minnesota courts jurisdiction in most situations where a child is present in Minnesota for the purpose of obtaining gender-affirming care. A Minnesota judge is prohibited from issuing a warrant for the arrest of a person, or a law enforcement officer from arresting a person charged in another state for a crime arising from acts committed in Minnesota involving gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming healthcare encompasses a wide range of social and media interventions to affirm someone's internal gender identity, including puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, permanent hair removal, voice therapy, and surgical interventions. Now, I chose this because it just blurs right across the line.
Right. Who cares what the parent says, right?
It's exactly the stance that Minnesota appears to have taken from what I've seen. It's this idea of we have this group of psychologists and psychiatrists that have attested that in these formative years, these children need to be supported in a specific way. And if you, as the parent, decide that you do not agree with it or you are not going to support it, the state will step in and take control as a medical necessity and remove your rights as a parent. And that's terrifying.
Yeah, it is terrifying.
Especially when we start talking about concepts like gender transitioning, so puberty blockers, right? There's this idea, and I've heard it repeated multiple times that it's just a pause. We're just hitting a pause button on puberty, and when you start to go through someone with gender dysphoria, let's say, starts to go through puberty, it can be a distressing time. Their body can begin developing in ways that they don't feel comfortable with. I don't know who was comfortable in puberty, but I wasn't one of them.
Start growing hair where there was no hair.
Right. Now I'll exceed that we are talking about a different type of discomfort, but still, nevertheless, the idea that you can remedy this situation by stepping in and just hitting pause on puberty is absurd. It makes no sense. The drugs that are used to do this are actually the same drugs that are used in chemical castration of sex offenders.
Yep.
So let's be real. We are talking about chemically castrating children, and that's I don't know how that subject comes up without at least acknowledging the murkiness of the water that we're in, right? Because the second you start talking about a parent is not doing an adequate job of supporting their child at 10 years old, 11 years old, and the state sees it as a human rights issue that we need to step in and intervene, you cross into a whole realm of problematic behavior on the part of the state and violations of rights what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I just think it's wrong.
Yeah.
So
I do too.
I mean, there's not much to think about. I mean, you're going to take away somebody's kid who's having like problems identifying what gender they are, and then you're going to basically force them to get something that they might not be happy with
Right.
by the time they're 18.
Right. We won't allow them to get a tattoo. We won't, because they're not old enough to make the decision. We won't allow them to drink alcohol or purchase alcohol because they're not old enough to make that decision. We won't allow them to smoke.
Right.
Because that permanently affects your brain and your body.
Don't even let them think about renting a car or something.
Right, can't rent a car until what, 24, right?
25.
25, there you go. And so but when a 10-year-old says, and I don't want to be reductive in this. I don't want to oversimplify the situation by saying, oh, a 10-year-old just says I want to be a boy and they make it happen. I understand it's not that overt and it's not that simplistic. There are a whole slew of factors that are involved with the whole concept of gender dysphoria, and I don't know. I don't know the solution to it, because it's a challenge. How do you deal with children that? And there are tons of studies that show that this is on the rise, that this is happening at prodigious rates that we've never experienced before. Why is it that as high, according to some estimates, as high as 25 to 30% of children in public school systems in the United States today, and I think this will very clearly vary from state to state, but in some places, as high as 25 to 30% are identifying as some form of LGBTQI++, right? Which I'm not, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because where we began, right? We started talking about the role of the government and what the government has a right to be involved in. And it begins to look like there has been some concerted effort to redefine the responsibilities of the state when it comes to parenting your children and the role that whoever, again, this is the royal they, I don't know who they are specifically, but when they make a decision that the parent has made a choice that's not in the best interest of the child.
Right, the higher ups.
Right.
Make that decision. Apparently,
right.
You're not doing a good job.
Right. You are now a risk to your own children, and since you're a risk to your own children, we are going to step in and take custody, take control, and so part of the challenge I have with this is that I get that my understanding on some points of it are oversimplified, right? To me, the thoughts that come to mind are things like, well, every child's uncomfortable in their body, right? Every child goes through an awkward phase in puberty where they don't know. I mean, they feel like they're different from everybody else. You feel like you're different from everybody else on the planet.
Yeah, you're awkward.
You're completely awkward. Your body's changing. You're changing, and I don't know how, because it seems insidious to me, but I don't know how the idea that this was a choice came into play, right? That a young man or a young lady can just decide to be whatever they want to be, and because they have that power, and that is part of. I think it's dangerous to teach children that this is something that's subjective, or something that on a case-by-case basis, it may be the case that you're supposed to have been a boy. I would love for us to find a chance to talk to somebody about this, in fact, because I want to understand. I want to understand how it's viewed when, male and female, seems to me like a binary, but it seems to me like a binary because every one of your cells are male, right? Whether you're XY or, whatever your chromosomal composition is, every cell in your body reflects that. So there's a lot I don't understand. I think we should probably find a chance to engage someone and discuss this, in depth with them, because, yeah.
It's probably something we may never understand, when we get to that point. It could be outside forces, happening, not just people saying, or the things that you see, not because it's the popular thing to be.
Right. Then you get into the whole in-crowd thing, and people who feel on the outsides of the cliquey groups, they don't feel like they fit in, and again, I don't want to make too many assumptions based on all of that. Puberty was awkward. I mean, there was nothing fun about it.
I was going to say, like, you talk about, I guess, when our generation, with the hormones and everything, kind of hit puberty a little bit sooner than
Who's
most. like our generation, like what was
Hit
the
puberty sooner.
milk, or it hit us harder maybe than hit because we started growing facial hair,
Mm. Yeah. I
around
didn't.
12
I
and
still
stuff
can't
like
grow a
that.
beard, so.
Well, I mean, you got pretty much good stuff right now, so you're doing pretty good. You're doing pretty good.
Right,
You
right.
caught up.
You're looking at it. You're looking at as much as facial hair as I can grow. Yeah. But no,
But
I'm joking around with you. But
but I mean, you can understand like it could be like the food, the hormones, the
yeah,
chemicals,
and
and things like
right,
that.
and then that breaks into an entire different aspect of this
Yeah.
conversation because then you have things like PFAOs, the different chemicals that are being put in our foods, and
Mm.
the fact that so many of us are drinking now out of plastic and eating out of plastic bottles so regularly that we all have microplastics in our
Yeah,
body as a
it's everywhere.
yes, it's everywhere. And so the ultimate question gets raised, are we poisoning ourselves? Are we poisoning our children?
We most definitely are.
We most certainly are. I mean, I think there have been enough Roundup, not to disparage Roundup specifically, but there have been enough Roundup lawsuits that have shown the effects of pesticides and things like that.
Mm.
And that's a big issue because now we have monocrops, in the United States where they basically spray these fields with Roundup and it kills everything except just the crop that's been genetically
Yeah,
modified
the
to survive
GMOs.
it.
Yeah.
And so, and I mean, there's nothing green. The rats won't survive, right? The crickets don't survive. And so with these monocrops, you end up completely devastating the soil and the environment. But that aside, we
Yeah.
end up ingesting tons and tons of poisons into our body.
Yeah, and we won't know those effects, probably for, maybe a generation, maybe
Well,
a decade.
I would make the argument that we are seeing those effects. We are seeing those effects
Well,
in things
yes,
like what percentage of U.S. Let's say Americans.
it didn't even go off on a tangent, but
But this one felt worth it. I was okay with that. I pluralized that on accident. So right now, it is estimated that as of 2024, 2.21% of adults in the United States have ASD or on the autism spectrum.
Yeah, definitely.
And so, and not
Mhm,
just
yeah.
that one in specific. We've also seen a prevalence of things like ADHD, Tourette's syndrome, narcolepsy, sleep apnea, things that 100 years ago were almost
Not
non-existent.
even 100 years. I
They
mean,
they certainly weren't existent as a percentage of the population. And you're right, it was back into the 70s is what I'm
yeah, when we went to
thinking.
school, did we see a lot of autistic children or
Autism, no,
a
not
lot
that I
of
recall.
ADHD?
Now we are of the generation where ADHD became went on the rise, where it
Where it
rose
kinda
up.
started.
That's where it started, and it may have begun before us. I wasn't studying, high school populations before we were born, but the
Should have been. Should have been more
right should have been
diligent, yeah.
slacking. I'm just slacking, but the idea is somewhere in that neighborhood, somewhere in the 70s, 80s, and there's this intersection of potentially contributable factors, right? So whether we're talking about the shift in the way that our food was produced and the rise of GMOs or the pollution of the environment with different substances, whether it be paint seeping into local water supplies or like I said, PFAOs that are being pushed through tons and tons of the food that we eat. Or we could also make an argument for the rise of the use of high fructose corn syrup, right? High fructose corn syrup, by all rights, appears to be one of the most poisoning things that we've introduced to the diet, and it's in almost everything in the United States, in almost everything.
Yeah.
And so it's
Foods
this
should be banned.
right, and actually that's one of the things I was excited about with the Trump administration was the idea that introducing Robert F. Kennedy, right, RFK, that's what he is attempting to do, is to have an impact on this,
Oh yeah, I remember.
because he's been a lobbyist or an attorney for not a lobbyist. He's been an attorney for 25, 30 years, whatever it's been, suing these companies. He sued Monsanto at one point for I think it was billions of dollars, like $10 or $12 billion, and won. And so he's intimately familiar with the ties between the FDA, the EPA, the USDA, and say big ag, big agriculture, and all the different factors involved. And we're at a point in time where we can no longer accept the complacency of the United States government sitting back going, oh, well, we just haven't tested that. Or we don't know. We don't see any causal relationships. Yeah,
There's
you're
no
not
reason
looking.
for that. Yeah, because there's other countries that have already done the studies, right?
Yes, they have. EU has done this. A lot of these, Germany and a lot of the European nations have done it. And we have something like 120 some odd chemicals in our foods that are not allowed, that are illegal to put in consumables
Yeah.
in the European Union.
Yeah, you just mentioned like there was a news report talking about what cough medicine or Sudafed, things like that had chemicals in it that serve no purpose, and they're being pulled unless they get those chemicals out of it.
Just there for fun.
Just there for fun. Never worked. It doesn't work for anything. Like it was supposed to do, like congestion, things like that. So it's kind of concerning.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of concerning.
Yeah, because it's like you're just taking something that's not going to help you. You're paying money, you think it's going to make you better. It doesn't do anything, and it has chemicals in it that
right.
It's detrimental
Could be killing you. Right.
Your overall health.
So at minimum, it's false advertising, and maximum, it's attempted murder.
But I mean, I guess like in recent years, it looks like the FDA has been very vigilant, and it seems like they're pulling more and more products off that have been hurting people. It seems like they're being on top of food production with E. coli and salmonella, all that kind of stuff. So
I haven't had a distinct impression that they've improved, but it's nice to hear that somebody has.
Well, it just seems like it because I've seen more recalls happening through FDA acting. I don't know if they got more funding. That's something I hadn't researched. It's just something I just noticed.
Right.
No,
That makes sense. I'm not familiar with it, but So
let's just get back on topic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So to tie it back in, we have this situation. So that's one aspect, and we've kind of driven off on a branch there, but because we just talked about one aspect of this, because then there's the other aspect of let's say the freedom of speech or the attack on speech in the United States with regard to schools and books and education materials, right? So what type of materials are deemed inappropriate, and a lot of this, the arguments that the parents tend to make will be age-based, right? Like my fourth grader is not old enough to be exposed to this particular information. And it's been interesting to watch it play out in court cases across the country, because there are situations where I'm sure you've seen it online where someone will stand up in front of a school board and read excerpts from a book that's just completely inappropriate and
inappropriate for the meeting.
It's inappropriate for the adults sitting in the room, let alone for the kids that are supposedly checking this book out of the library. And in any other situation, if I found you and my kids hanging out with my kids and giving them these types of books, I could have you arrested for exposure to inappropriate materials or any number of things. And so, I mean, there also is an aspect of this, and the reason I mention this is because the NCAA, is that who we looked at originally that was talking about this issue?
No.
It was one of the rights organizations. Let's see, it was ACLU. Is that what it was? Yeah, it was the ACLU, and they were posing it as if it were, let's see, speech rising in the U.S. How far is speech under attack?
Censorship of school
curriculum. ACLU right there, yeah. So this was this one shocked me because this one took it a different direction, right? They went in the direction of vital educational resources are being denied, and we live in a state that is one of the ones that have banned it. Is the materials on critical race theory and or CRT. And so the ACLU is positing that this is tantamount to censorship, saying that the laws that have been passed in 10 states apparently, and among them are Oklahoma, Tennessee, Idaho, New Hampshire, Texas, and presumably 6 or 7 others. But passed classroom censorship laws regulating discussions even. So the discussions have been regulated that teachers are now allowed to have with students about race, gender, sexuality, and systemic inequality.
Yeah.
And that kind of hits on the theme that we tend to cover and tend to debate is systemic inequality, and the idea of at what age should we begin talking about different topics, whether we're talking about race, whether we're talking about racial injustice, or talking about gender, and sexuality. Are those things that there is an appropriate age at which the school should begin talking to your students about this?
No,
Or is this something
me,
that, as it feels to me, should belong in the home with the parent?
yeah, this definitely shouldn't be a subject that you want in school. I don't want a teacher, if I had kids, talking to my kids about racial inequality and
Right.
all these other things that they're talking about. Is something I think that the state shouldn't allow the teachers to do. That's definitely something that you will want to talk to your kids about as a parent.
Right. Well,
You know,
so what I'm thinking is, let's go ahead. We're right around the time. Let's go ahead and wrap this on the public side, and we'll go over, and because I would like to discuss that particular topic, as far as the rights and racial racial communication, racial disparities, and racial tensions, and communicating that with kids, and what role that plays in schools. And so, yeah, is there anything that we've missed that before we wrap up that you can think of that you wanted to cover? Or
no. I mean,
Okay.
I think we went around the world with
We did.
some of our tangents and stuff.
We did. That's okay though. We are in control of that.
Yeah, we can do things.
We can go where we want. We can do things. That's right. We can do things. I can do things. All right. Well, then, yeah, I guess this wraps it. And I've mentioned this in prepping, but this is probably going to be the last one that just you and I do. So we're about to kick off our career as investigative interviewers.
Investigative interviewers. Interesting.
Right. Our next episode is going to be the first one that we bring someone in and talk with them about their experience. And, I'm not going to say who it is just yet, but we have some pretty exciting guests that are going to come in and talk with us and share their experiences with us and discuss the country at large with us. So, yeah.
Yeah, I hope this will be an enjoyable experience for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely want to learn some things about some cultures that I've never known before.
Exactly. And I'm really interested to see how they experience the United States and how they experience our culture and some of the challenges